Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Reverends Jeya and Daniel So. Jeya and Daniel are the co-founders and co-lead pastors of Anchor City Church, a third culture community in San Diego, California, and parents to a wonderful daughter starting college in the fall. So as you listen to this, she'll be through her first semester, hopefully. They are contributing authors to the upcoming book, Deconstructing Church Planting, Reconstructing a Post-Colonial and Post-Industrial Pneumatology for the Next Generation of Churches, as well as other books, one of which we'll be talking about, Sustaining Grace. Jeya also works as a coach, cohort leader, and in other capacities with church and industry leaders in several denominations and organizations, including the PCUSA's 1001 New Worshiping Communities, Cyclical Inc., and Isaac, Innovative Space for Asian American Christianity. Daniel serves as director of Cyclical San Diego, a diverse grassroots network of faithful innovators and church starters. During the pandemic, Jeya has enjoyed exploring hidden places in San Diego that reveal new and wonderful things about the city that she loves, and when it's safe to do so, Daniel will be front and center in the mosh pit at local hardcore shows. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but let's welcome Reverends Jeya and Daniel So. All right, welcome to the show, Jeya and Daniel So. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I guess the one thing we have to mention, I know you mentioned this, but we have a daughter. She's 18 and going to college. And so anyone listening out there, prayers for that, because it's a new world for us. And so I think that's the biggest thing that's going on with us right now. But other than that, I think, I don't know. Do you have anything you want to add?
Nope, I'm good.
Yeah.
You know, I have one of my good friends, pastor friends, just dropped her son off, and she's just texting all of our clergy group about how she was bawling that whole night. So I can only imagine. Thankfully, I'm not yet there with my kids. So let's try to. I want to hear both of your stories if you're both willing to share, just kind of about what your faith story has looked like and looks like today.
Sure. I mean, I think and I know we'll get into it a little bit. For me, a lot of my faith in learning to love and follow Jesus has been discovering who God has made me to be. So my ethnic background is Korean, but I was born and raised in Michigan, so full on Michigander. When Jeya and I first got married, I would do the Michigan hand map to anyone who was from there, and so she's adapted to that pretty quickly. Long-suffering Tigers and Lions fan, right? Yeah. So I mostly watch to yell and feel bad. So that's my sports fandom. But one sort of side effect of having grown up out there in Michigan in the Midwest, especially back in like the late 70s, 80s, into the 90s, not a whole lot of Asian American folks out there, and not particularly diverse. And so it was kind of, it was a weird place to figure out in adolescence, like, who am I? And, what's sort of what's life going to look like? What's my way forward? And I think that's for me where my faith journey really became a redemptive sort of aspect of finding out hope for the future and how to live. And so, like I said, I know that's going to be tied into some of the church planting and all that good stuff. But yeah, so if nothing else, that the Tigers give me so much pain. And so that's where I'm coming from.
It's formation. It's, suffering.
Love it.
Yeah.
Jay, how about you?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Southern California, and my faith background actually is we always kind of went to church with my mom, but my parents separated when I was 8, and she kind of turned to the church, and we actually to a church that was pretty charismatic / Pentecostal, really great, really formative, helped me to do a lot of stuff. They were very heavy into missions. So when I was in high school, I got to do a lot of like trips abroad that I, as the child of a single parent, I would never have been able to do. So it was really good, but also still some of like the theology that was being taught was like they didn't mean for it to be, but very works based or very, Pentecostal charismatic, so very science based as well. And so in some ways, I think as I grew older, like going through, faith crises in like college and then ending up in seminary and past seminary, even into church planting, like there's been kind of this relearning of what it means to be Christian, right? And probably more, like we talked a lot about grace like most churches do, but and it wasn't that they didn't practice it. I don't want to come off feeling too critical, but it just wasn't like practically taught, right? Like there was kind of a lot of legalism and judgment. And so unlearning a lot of that has been like where it's been happening recently, and just being more accepting, figuring out what it means to be graceful and speaking the truth in love and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, that's all of it in like 10 seconds. I don't know. I didn't talk about being a Dodgers fan because there's no suffering there.
They're super good.
For our listeners who are not viewing this, I'm wearing a Yankees hat, partly because I don't have a lot of hair and the light will, shine off my balding head. Yeah. But yeah, I am a Yankees fan and not a lot of suffering in my life. Right. My other hat, though, here is a Bills fan, and I can relate there as a childhood Bills fan. Thanks for sharing that. I also feel like I have to say, y'all are both Princeton grads, and I was joking about this with Karen Rohr when she was on, which is the true PTS. Because I went to Phillips Theological Seminary, also another PTS. Right. So I think, unfortunately, Princeton Theological Seminary gets the most fame at that PTSs, but all good schools. We'll give them all a shout out. Pittsburgh, where Karen teaches. Well, share, if you would, some spiritual practices that have been meaningful for you or you might recommend to others.
Yeah, so actually, for the last, I would say like 5 or 6 months at church, we've been preaching about Sabbath. And I think particularly in this COVID world, like my father, for instance, he's still working. And we were supposed to go on vacation with him, and he does textiles. So his company pivoted from making like clothes and backpacks to doing PPE. And so I said, hey, Dad, we should go on vacation together because you haven't had a break. And really, in 18 months, he's not gone on vacation. He barely even had a day off. And we find that, like, since everyone's working from home, people aren't able to take a break. And even if they are able to take a break, like mentally, they are unable to take a break. And the same goes true for both of us. Like, at the beginning of pandemic, at the beginning of quarantine, I had to be working all the time. And if I wasn't working all the time, I was feeling guilty for not doing something, like even more so. And so we've just really are trying really hard. Like it goes against, I think, our like what we've been taught so deeply within us that, that we're not what we do. We are who we are because of, God and God's love. And then we work from out of that overflow, so then we don't have to feel so, so tied to our work, to the jobs that we do. And so we've just been really trying hard to take Sabbath seriously, daily and, weekly. And now, and we are not the best models, but we're learning. And so that's kind of one of the things that I think, recent spiritual practices that we've been beginning to take really seriously.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I was thinking about, I heard this some time ago during that we don't work from home. It's almost like we live from work, or we live, we don't work from home, we live at work, that we're in this situation, and, many of us have found ourselves in. So yeah, definitely a good one. Daniel, how about you?
Yeah, definitely the Sabbath thing is so present. I think our church community is largely Asian American, and so we kind of get a double whammy. It's like the Western Protestant work ethic and the immigrant hustle is part of our story. And so people can never turn it off. So like Jeya said, that you are not what you produce, like that's really hard to get at that soul level. And I think just going along, like personally, one of the practices that has been really helpful for me, and I'm going to be really transparent, it's been super hard. And at first I hated it. So, but just silence. And I think that practice, we engaged it as a family of three, even before COVID. Before we would drive our daughter to school, we would practice like 60 seconds of guided silence. And, Jeya often uses this image of like, we have all these tabs open in our head, and it's running in the background and draining our brain CPU all the time. And, like verbal prayer is great, expressing things. We're big believers in all of that. But just simply sitting before God, and that has been surprisingly restorative. And the reason I say I hated it at first is that I'm a total like checklist person. So if I didn't have it on the checklist, but I did it, I'll go back and write it and then check it off. Like that's how much I love it. So it's hard to, right? It's so hard to turn it off. And so, even trying to do like prayer that, it just always turns into like kind of a task kind of thing. So learning to drown out the rabbit trails that I would chase down and all of the, thoughts of this and this and this, like it was really hard for me to engage that. But, just being faithful in practicing it, just trying to show up again and again. And again, quite frankly, like failing at silence feels bad because it's like, man, I can't even do this. But slowly getting there, and it's just surprisingly restorative.
Well, I keep hearing that again and again. As someone who hates silence, it feels like that might be the little prompting from the Spirit there. So. Thanks for sharing that. Let's talk about, so Jeya, you wrote a book, you wrote a chapter in a book, Sustaining Grace, on third culture leaders. And I was going to just talk to Jeya, and she offered the opportunity to talk to Daniel too. And I said, let's do it. So grateful to have you both on to talk about this. But let's talk about kind of what the term third culture leader means, and then share, if you would, how your church is a third culture church.
Yeah. So I have to say, my name is on the chapter, but we really did develop the ideas together. And so he just didn't want his name on the chapter. So it's okay, which is fine. I got to keep the pay for it. So it's great. But
20 cents or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. You understand.
Those are well-paying books, any kind of ministry book.
Exactly. But so we take the term third culture from, it was developed amongst like missionary and diplomat kids actually from the West who were like going to different places. And it essentially just means children of parents who did not grow up in the culture that the children are growing up in. Right. And so that's like at the most basic form. And so they've had to form a third culture, right? One which is both in its like best form. And so actually here in the States, like the stories that we like to tell is for those of us who grew up here in the States as third culture kids, like many of us would go back to our parents' home cultures. My grandmother called me the American kid, right? And so to my grandmother, even though I was Korean by heritage, I wasn't Korean for her, right? But then I would come here back to the States, and constantly, still to this day, right? People are reminding me that I don't really belong here.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of, in Christ, right? It becomes redeemed from being neither this nor that to being both and, right? You're both this and that. And so I think for the two of us, for our journeys, that was like really redemptive. I mean, we talk about Christ sometimes as a third culture kid. And so it really is just a way to talk about, all of those of us who are trying to synthesize two cultures and to make sense of it and to see it in a positive light as opposed to a negative light.
Interesting.
And so and so third culture leader basically are just people like us who happen to be third culture and are leading ministries or whatever that we're doing.
So with your church, then it's kind of that, just in a corporate setting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of our church folks are third culture folks, as I think Dan mentioned. And so most of us, although it's interesting, we do have quite a few like more recent immigrants, but it's usually because they've married into like a third culture, or they're coming here and they're realizing that they're third culture people. Like even though they didn't grow up in this culture, they have had to, like we had one woman, she grew up in Japan and came here as an adult, but she said to me point blank, I don't feel Japanese and I don't feel American. I don't know what I am. And that's even though she grew up in her parents' home culture. And so we have gathered people who are like that, who might find just a sense of like belonging through that, and a sense of understanding themselves better, understanding their faith better through being in a church that's their culture. And that actually is really applicable to even children of non-immigrants. We have so many microcultures, right, in our society. And I think a lot of people feel like they're on the outside. Dan could probably talk a little bit about like hardcore music and why he loves it so much. But like really, like there's this heart for us, for people who don't feel like they belong anywhere, to tell them like through Christ that they're precious and they're beloved and they belong. And so that's our kind of vision of a third culture church. And it plays out in different kinds of ways through the worship and through how we, I guess how we form things, but that's the main thrust of it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing that. Since you mentioned this, let me ask you, in the chapter you wrote something about, how redemption in Christ helps third culture people realize their voices can and should be heard. How does that play out? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think part of that neither nor experience is feeling like a perpetual foreigner. You see that a lot in this last pandemic year. Hate crimes against the AAPI communities, and it's not just the out and out sort of verbal or physical assault. I think, I know a word like microaggressions kind of gets misused in different ways, but a lot of third culture folks experience that their whole lives. And some good research shows that the accumulation of a lifetime of racial microaggressions is the same net effect as PTSD. And so you have a traumatized people who, in a lot of ways, feel like their job is just to try to get by, just try to make a living. And again, that's not limited to just third culture people. But as we're looking at the folks that God is gathering in our church, and as we think about the people we're naturally drawn to, that idea that your dreams, your voice, your hopes matter. That even if they were told, I want to be a singer, I want to be a writer, and they were told that's so foolish, that's so impractical, somehow to kind of circle back and say, yeah, maybe it's foolish, maybe it's impractical, but if somehow that's a part of what God is dreaming for you, let's figure that out together. Let's make a space where we can have some open-ended conversations that don't always fall back into the pragmatic stuff. So when we think about third culture leaders, I think one of the strengths, and this is something that we try to draw out of folks, naturally we navigate between different cultural lenses pretty easily. And a lot of times people don't even realize that they do it. Like the obvious stuff is like language code switching, but like for example, I hardly speak Korean. We have a couple of little ones at church that primarily speak Korean, and they're much better than me. And so I'll run out of words in like 15 seconds or less. So it's not just code switching, but it's like learning to adapt, learning to find common ground with people. Like that's a very natural expression for a lot of third culture folks. And so we try to lean on that as a real gift of God, empathy for people who maybe don't look like us, but similarly, like Jeya said, kind of feel like they're on the outside. And I think, especially in the United States, that's just more and more folks just feeling like, where do I put both feet down? Like, I don't know where I belong.
Yeah. I was interested, you use the word kind of accumulated trauma there, and that's something I wanted to ask about. Just how Christianity has had such a horrible legacy, especially in America, of really oppressing and marginalizing minority cultures and communities. And you write in this chapter, Jeya, that Christ does not erase our cultural or ethnic heritage, but rather redeems it. Has it been? I know I've talked to some indigenous leaders, and they talked about the ways it's been a struggle for folks to connect with Christianity because of the history of Christianity oppressing indigenous populations. Has there been similar struggles that you've encountered in your ministry?
I think in some ways it's definitely not to the degree that Native people have, right? Like First Nations people, for sure. I think though part of it is in Christianity, like we hear as Asian American Christians often we'll hear like, oh, we don't see color, right? Like we don't. And, kind of this challenge of like, well, if I walk into your church, I should just be able to worship with you, unless it's like language based, right? Because we don't use, like, English is our majority language. And so I think there's this sense of like, it goes to like not as like these big in your face kind of out and out aggressions, but really the microaggressions of like trying to erase ourselves, right? Oh, I just see you as a fellow sister or brother. I don't see color. I don't see race. And when we say that, like there's this redemption of our ethnic heritage, like, yeah, actually it's pretty cool that you're Korean or Chinese or Japanese or, what have you, that you come from. And you were made this way for a reason, that God made you this way for a reason, to express like the beautiful, picture of God in all of God's fullness, and we get to contribute to that, right? As opposed to you should like just try to assimilate. And that's like, I know that it is within many different cultures, but within the Asian American cultures in particular, there's a lot of push towards assimilation, right? Keep your head down, just try to like be as American as possible when you're in these American settings and try to be as Asian as possible in your Asian settings, And there's a real dissonance there when you don't get to like really bring the two together. And so, I think that's more of like what we're looking at.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. I'm thinking of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with an author, Elizabeth Hagen. She recently wrote a book. I interviewed her for, called Brave Church. And one of the things that from her church that I found really, really challenging, but also helpful, her book was primarily written towards, or for, white American Christians, was just the importance of understanding that, like, I forget how she said it, but basically, like, our words have an impact, whether we meant them harmfully or not, that we need to be responsible for our words. So I'm just thinking of, what you were just saying, Jay, and then Daniel, your thoughts about microaggressions, how, our words have impacts, whether we meant them harmfully or not, we still need to be responsible for our words. And I found that helpful.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, Lauren, it's funny. I mean, I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this, but I think one of the real eye-opening things about the damage of white supremacy culture, especially within churches, is that it doesn't just hurt people of color, it hurts white people too.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you the number of times we've spoken with friends who are white, and we'll start talking about ethnic and cultural heritage, and they'll say, I'm just a generic white person. And it's like, one, that's not true. And two, the idea of culture is not just something from, well, my family has German or Irish roots. It's like our country has a culture too. And that's something to draw out. Certainly, if there are things that need to be course corrected, absolutely. Church should be at the forefront of that with humility and love. But then also to see, as Christ is redeeming the good things that we can offer as gifts, that's something that, it's one of those things that people don't always recognize. And, again, as we noted, on the flip side, without having eyes to see that the default sort of white culture, it's like the air we breathe, the water that we swim in, people don't realize that it's there. I remember years ago, I was at a pastor's gathering, and the speaker was talking about, we have this really multicultural church, and, sometimes groups have like a brochure type of church, like one of each on the cover. And that's happened numerous times to us, like numerous times. So this person's talking, and thankfully I was with a group of sharp leaders who could kind of see through that. And so when it came time for the Q&A, because the speaker was bragging about, oh, we have people from 25 different countries and 15 different languages or whatever kind of thing, and so people started asking, well, tell us about the culture of your leadership. Tell us about how you identify leaders. Tell us how you identify and work through conflict. And because they kept saying, well, we don't have culture, we have kingdom culture, but what came out was that it was just white American culture, which in itself is not bad. I mean, and again, I think that's something that's very uncomfortable for folks to talk about. They feel like automatically it's bad, or automatically, gosh, we need to move on because, my shoulders are up by my ears and my toes are curling. I feel so weird. And so, for us, I think on the one hand, it's more natural. A lot of third culture Asian American folks, like, we know we have an ethnic and cultural identity. But that's, I think, one of the ways that we speak back to the broader church and offer as a gift our experience. It's not just limited to people who look like us, but it's kind of, as we've been saying, this broader experience. I mean, if you even just think about Christians, the church being sent by God into the world, and Jeya alluded to Jesus being a third culture kid. A lot of us are familiar with Jesus being a refugee in a lot of ways. But even passages like Philippians 2, where Jesus leaves behind the majesty of the heavenly kingdom and enters into the full humanity and the mess that we are, Jesus knows what it is to bridge cultures and to bridge worlds and to step firmly into both and to bring people together. And that, I think, as we think about, if we have hopes for the future of the church, it's to have a stronger sense of who we are so that we can lead with empathy, so that we can lead with humility and love, and not feel, we see that a lot of folks who feel like giving and sacrificing, it's a zero-sum game. So if someone else gains, I lose, and that feels horrible. And it's kind of like, well, that's the mystery of following Jesus, especially in this third culture way. It multiplies, and how does it work? I don't know, but somehow, there's a gift of invitation to us in that as well.
Yeah, that really is the paradox, right? In losing your life, you find it. I mean, can't explain it. I want to ask kind of about that third culture, and I'm intrigued by your Philippians 2, for instance. Let this mind be in you. Am I quoting the right verse here? Is that Philippians 2, right? Hopefully. But I'm
Yeah.
let me see if I can. I'm curious, like, if I'm hearing you right, it almost sounds like that Christians and maybe Christian leaders, or both of us, we're called to be like third culture people in a way. Does that make sense? Like, because our culture of, I don't know, our society at large, we got the kingdom, like true kingdom culture, like the kingdom of God culture. And then, so is that fair?
Yeah, actually, that's in our church right now. We're studying First Peter, and it's as a women's Bible study, and it's been really interesting to see like how much Peter talks about like what people's identity is, right? Like their identity in Christ, and then, you have this idea of like, yeah, you are foreigners and exiles, right? Like you live in this world as foreigners and exiles, but then to like kind of like also, then you've got the Jeremiah 7 passage where it's like you should live, like flourish where you are and work for the shalom of the people around you, right? And so there is this sense of like, yeah, you might not be of here, but still, like there's this work that you do as foreigners and exiles. You don't silo yourselves, but you really try to live within, bringing the peace of God to all those that are with you, right? Understanding yourself really deeply, and then, with love and care, reaching out to the community around you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask something else too. I think, Daniel, you said this about folks, if I heard you right, basically saying that kingdom culture, defining kingdom culture, but really, it's really just American culture. And And I think that's a real big problem, especially in American, I don't know, mainstream Christianity. And I remember seeing it like I took this class on like missional entrepreneurship recently, and it really seemed like a lot of the I don't know, business principles that folks were taking to persons in other parts of the world were almost like just American business values that aren't necessarily Christian. But so I'm curious y'all's thoughts on just like this equation, equalization, that's the word, equalization of like what we say is kingdom culture with really just kind of like a shinier Christianized version of like white American culture, like especially like business culture. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, Lauren, it's funny because maybe back in like the 80s and 90s, I think there was literally a book called Jesus CEO. And
Probably.
yeah, I mean, I'll be, yeah, I haven't read it. Maybe it's a great book. But I think the concept, like the analogy that we have for what church is and what it means to be the people of God together ends up influencing so much of how we like that, the hows and the what's of it. So, there's obviously that sort of industrialized version, like church is a factory and we need to produce more religious widgets, or church is a shopping mall and we're the religious professionals offering goods and services. And I think recently with church planting, like you said, entrepreneurship is fun. Like we love Shark Tank at home. It's so much fun to watch, right? And it feels pretty exciting to think, wow, in a sort of spiritual way, we can be out there in the world on the cutting edge, looking for investors and, 5x, 10x our initial investment, all this kind of stuff. Like I get the allure of that. But Lauren, I think you're right to identify that just kind of plays into the old mindset of bigger, newer, faster, like that automatically means it's better. And I think, you think about like app developers who are like, I just want to get bought by Apple, Google, or, whoever. And it's like, there's something that we don't want to pick up in that for people who are planting new churches. Like, I think entrepreneurship has a lot to say. I'm a big fan of human-centered design. And I think starting with empathy, starting with understanding folks, and then developing creativity and innovation from there, that says a lot to me. I think that's a great analogy. So like when we picture our church, we always talk about tables. It's not to say that that's like the best way. It's just how we talk about church. And so, and again, this is kind of a third culture thing. It's kind of how a lot of us grew up. For many Asian Americans, they didn't hear their parents say the words, I love you, but they would hear them ask, did you eat? And that meant, I love you. And in the meantime, we've heard from Black friends from other cultural and ethnic backgrounds, when they come home after a long time away, mom or dad will say, there's food in the fridge. And that means I really missed you, right? And so it's not just Asian American folks. I mean, all kinds of cultures have this. And so tables are really important to us, and to sort of step away from that rush of productivity, of earning, of achieving, and to just sit and be welcomed, to be valued and affirmed for who you are. And I think that's kind of a funny thing in today's day and age of church planting. I'm sure you went through this as well. You meet another church planter or pastor, and the first question they ask is, so what numbers are you running these days? And we're like, really huge, 45.
Well, for our listeners, my son is home, so we have special guest music in the background. So please play along. I want to ask here before I forget to, kind of shifting. You had something in there about how changing our attitudes toward post-Christendom can help us all. And in my mind, as I see it, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on right now in our American culture at large, especially among white people, about this kind of move away from Christendom. How can that help us all, that move away?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, it's it's a movement back to like authentic faith. It's funny because we talk so much about culture in our Christianity, and then we talk about that, as opposed to cultural Christianity, right? Which is what Christendom really is, right? And so I think, actually identifying our culture, like our third cultureness, our home culture, our adoptive cultures, helps us to realize how much like Christendom is actually cultural Christianity. And if we can do away with that and get to something that's more authentic for all people, right? Something that really is about loving your neighbor, understanding and loving ourselves and loving our neighbors and loving God through these different acts. I think that's something that will really help actually Christians not only and I keep coming back to understanding ourselves, and I don't mean to like be so about like, oh, my own identity, but there's so much of like our identities being formed by this and shaped by what we do and who others tell us to be. So if we can really understand ourselves as beloved, right? And like just our being, right? To be. And that's like worth, right? Then there's this really beautiful message that's counter to the world. And so then I think in that sense, there's this beautiful message that we send out to people who aren't of faith, but also to ourselves. The church becomes this place of grace and love and truth and authenticity that it's not been for so many years.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let me ask one more question then before we take a break. If I can get you to hang with me a little bit longer here. My mind is still intrigued by your conversation around table. And as I think before I started recording, we were just talking about both of our denominational affiliations. Jeya and Daniel are with the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the USA.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm ordained with the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. And I know there's a lot of folks perhaps listening. Google them if you don't know the great groups of churches. But in my tradition, communion and table is a really big part. And I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a question, but I'm intrigued by this how the possibility for connection, that's not the word, integration. Just there's maybe a beautiful synergy between what you're talking about, table, and the Eucharist, Lord's Communion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so funny because there's this like movement towards dinner church, right? Like that we kind of saw. And we were cracking up because actually in immigrant churches, dinner church, like not in the same kind of way, like it's always been a part of the immigrant church experience, right? Our very good and smart friend, Dr. Joyce Del Rosario, she has a whole thing about Filipino potluck theology that we just absolutely love. And so I think that was one thing for us. I grew up in a church where communion was like done like twice a year. Super special, right? Like the people wore gloves. We had it was so, it was such an ordeal, right? And so then I think for us, we try to do communion more regularly, right? And it is part of the PCUSA tradition it's supposed to be done more regularly, but it's been super fun to kind of explore that as a family gathering. And so we often will try to have communion before maybe we eat together, right? Which hasn't been happening a whole lot during COVID, but we'll definitely do it at least once a month, and definitely everyone's invited. And my favorite moment, I mean, the whole reason why I wanted to get ordained really was to do communion and to do baptisms, right? And so my favorite moment is like when the kids run up and they're just so eager to take the elements, right? The bread and the cup, and like they just love it. And for them, that's church. Right? And so there's that tying in together. And when we tell them this is a table of Christ and all are invited, I have this actually, one of the little girls at our church, somebody mentioned, like, they call us PJ and PD for Pastor Dan and Pastor Jeya. And one of the little girls says, "You mean the girl who gives the bread and the guy who gives the juice?" Right? And like, that's how she identifies us. Like, we're the people who help come into this space and nourish. And so I think there is something that is really beautiful there that we really love and appreciate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we often talk about when you sit down at a table and you open your mouth to the food, you're opening your heart to the person across the table from you. Mm. And ultimately, that's Jesus' invitation. So often, even simple things like we'll pray like Jesus is the head of the table and welcoming us all. And I think that that sort of speaks to slowing down rhythms. You don't want to rush through a meal. And as Jeya described, my experience of communion growing up was so serious. It felt more like a funeral than anything else. And so we thankfully have just been able to get really far away from that and to experience the joy, the acceptance, and the embrace at that table.
Yeah, I would also add too, I think for me, I've experienced so much change and transformation, I feel like, when eating with people. And that's, again, I think that's what's such the powerful metaphor and imagery of the communion table, is there's opportunity for all of that. And that's just awesome. Well,
yes, so good.
I want to respect your time. So let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverends Jeya and Daniel So. So thanks for being here. Thanks for your time. Feel free to both answer these questions as you'd like. I always tell people you can take them seriously or not. So if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do? What does that day look like for you?
Yeah, actually, I saw that you had sent that in the pre-questions, and I was asking Dan, and we got kind of theological. We're like, oh, we would do this or we would do that, and then we're like, so I was just thinking about this morning, and I was like, I would really like to try the if it were like literal Pope, like the Catholic Pope, I would really love to just try the vestments on for a day. And I have this, we're Presbyterian, so collars are just about the limit, right? But man, I just love that, the finery of it all, right? And the high churchiness of it all. I just really have it. So that's kind of my silly answer. I just want to try that hat on.
Love it. The hat usually gets some love. So you're not alone there.
Oh, good.
How about you, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. Like Jeya said, my mind immediately went theological and ecclesiology kind of stuff. And I think for me, it's really about empowering all kinds of people to lead and to find their place. So if I was Pope, I would definitely cruise around in the Pope Mobile, and I'd be like, you're a leader, and you're a leader, and you're a leader.
Love it.
That's how it works, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're Pope. You can do it.
Right.
So that's a question, though. Would it be now that we're interviewing you together, would it be a co-popeship, or would you each get one day? Well, we'll have to see if that ever comes, how we'll figure that out.
I'd be down to share. That'd
share.
Cool.
It's good. You share. I can't imagine, as an aside, I can't imagine sharing ministry and jobs with my spouse. So blessings to you. Love my spouse. Love her.
Yeah.
That's another conversation. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
We've been, again, in kind of we learned no Korean history, right, growing up here. And that makes sense to me, right? We're growing up here in the States. But the Korean independence fighters against Japanese colonialism, a good group of them were Christian, And so, and they were pretty instrumental in fighting against colonization by the Japanese at the time. And so there's a young woman, her name was Yu Hwan-sun. She was 16, 17. She was martyred. But I would love to just talk to her and see what in your age, gave you the courage to be able to, fight against, people who are oppressing you in such a way. And so I would love to just be able to talk to her and see, what was going through her mind and what gave her the strength and courage to do that.
Cool. Daniel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my mind goes to the desert mothers and fathers, partly because I'm actually a hardcore introvert. So I'm a loud introvert. This is kind of confusing for folks. So partly the monastic life, isolated from folks, is kind of appealing. But I just think about, it's not a withdrawing from the world in a way that's so selfish and self-centered, but in a way that is for the life of the world around you. That's so mysterious and amazing to me, and I would love to learn more.
Awesome. I feel like I have to ask you about mosh pits at some point, but let me get through these questions then. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Oh boy.
I know that was.
I mean,
that was one that
if you
took
want to
some
skip
thinking,
that,
though.
we can just talk about
Yeah.
mosh pits.
My hope is actually that somehow that will be remembered for coming together to overcome incredible difficulties, right? I mean, incredible difficulties. So that's the hope. The fear is that this will be a time where we're remembered as like one of the stupidest times in humanity, right? Like that's the fear. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's kind of depressing, but yeah.
Daniel, any more positive than that?
Yeah, I know. Pick it up, man.
Well, I'll say this. So our daughter is Gen Z. She's heading off to college. We're both pretty firmly Gen Xers. So we grew up very cynical. Don't trust authority. All this kind of stuff. And I think there's some value to skepticism. There's some value to being cautious and with authority and those things. But I look at my daughter and the world that she's growing up in. I'm learning a little bit about movement chaplaincy and about multi-faith or non-faith spaces for justice, and how do we as people of faith navigate that in a helpful way. And like first and foremost, like the way people talk about the language around self-identity, culture, self-expression, it just blows me away. I mean, these young folks are light years ahead of where I was at their time. And I feel like I'm catching up, and I'm so inspired by them. And so, I mean, I have hope. It's so challenging because I feel like every day I'm learning a new word. And I always tell this to Jeya too. Like sometimes I hear something and I'm kind of afraid to Google it because I just don't know. But it's like, this radical new future that they're creating, and they're not waiting for permission from the old folks or whatever. I have a lot of hope in that. And like Jeya said, I would hope we'd be remembered for like folks like me in supporting that, in finding ways to affirm and value that, to clear the road for them as much as I can. And then as history looks back to say, like Jeya said, it was messed up. It was hard. It was brutally difficult. But somehow they overcame.
Yeah. Well, that was a good kind of hopeful answer. So let's make space for mosh pits as our last question. So tell me, Daniel, about mosh pits here.
So, I mentioned growing up as an Asian American kid in Michigan, and so it was pretty isolating. So around middle school, I started skateboarding, getting into like punk and hardcore music through that. And it's funny, like that was really one of the first outsider communities that I felt like I was a part of. So I've been to hundreds of punk rock shows over the years, and to this day I still go. I'm old, but I'll get there in the mosh pit. I'll bring earplugs. I literally wear a mouth guard because I am too old to be losing teeth in the pit. And so like I'll go and my daughter will be like, "Dad, don't hurt yourself."
We have to tell this. I have to tell this story. About 5 years ago, he comes home from a show and he's like, "Dude, Jay, it was amazing." I was like, "What happened?" He goes, "Hun, I got punched in the face and I can still take it." And I was like, "You're too old for this. Like, you cannot be doing that."
I let it go on the record. I am so proud because this huge young guy came whirling around and I just got full on, uppercut to the jaw. And I was still standing. I felt really good about that.
Split lip and everything.
See, folks, this is the life of a pastor, the secret life of a pastor.
Yes.
Well, tell the listeners where they can find out more about you, your work, and then the church.
Yeah, on the web, we're anchorcity.org. And all of our social handles are Anchor City SD. I do work with Cyclical San Diego, so that's cyclicalsd.org, and you can find all our social platforms there as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Let me leave you with a word of peace. May God's peace be with you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you as well.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romick-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.